Hey, tonight we're diving into the real Wild West. Not the Hollywood version with its heroic cowboys and dramatic showdowns, but the gritty, dangerous reality where survival was never guaranteed. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, but trust me, there's a reason they called it wild. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than, I'm always curious where you all are listening from. So drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why you might not survive even a single day in the untamed American frontier. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The good news: you're about to experience a legendary chapter of history firsthand. The bad news: your chances of survival just dropped dramatically. The first challenge hits you before you even open your eyes. The smell, not the earthy, pleasant aroma of nature you might expect, but something far more pungent. The stench of unwashed bodies, animal droppings, and what might possibly be raw sewage hanging heavy in the air. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Wild West. Most settlers considered a thorough wash a monthly luxury, and that's being generous. Some went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, was precious out here, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when you needed it for drinking and cooking. As you drag yourself from your bed, which is likely just a straw-filled mattress, crawling with bedbugs, you realize how every muscle in your body aches. Life in the 1870s frontier involved constant physical labor from dawn until dusk. There were no weekends off, no vacations, and certainly no ergonomic considerations. Whether you were a farmer, miner, or ranch hand, your body was your primary tool used until it broke down. You might think you work hard in your modern life, but frontier labor was something entirely different. Backbreaking work that left even the strongest people permanently hunched and arthritic by their 30s. Imagine spending 14 hours plowing fields, hauling water, chopping wood, or working deep underground in a mine shaft. No wonder the average lifespan was only about 35 years. Standing on the dusty floor, you notice the chill in the air. If it's winter, your cabin might be 20 degrees below. Freezing inside. If you had a fireplace, you'd have let it burn down overnight to save precious fuel. Good luck finding central heating or thermal underwear in this century. And if it's summer, well, get ready to sweat through every article of clothing you own. There was no escaping the elements in the Wild West. Speaking of clothing, forget comfort. Men typically owned maybe two sets of clothes, rough canvas or denim pants and cotton shirts that chafed against the skin. Women wore multiple layers regardless of the temperature, schmazes, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged in the dirt. Everything was scratchy, ill-fitting, and rarely cleaned. Those fancy outfits you've seen in Western movies, pure fiction for the average person. Your stomach growls, reminding you it's time for breakfast. Hope you like beans, biscuits, and coffee, possibly for every meal. The Wild West diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Meat, when available, was often preserved with salt or smoke, because refrigeration didn't exist. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, when your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was common among settlers. Despite being easily preventable with modern knowledge, you might think the coffee would at least be good. Cowboys always seem to have a pot brewing in the movies, but what you're served barely resembles what you'd recognize as coffee. It's typically boiled to within an inch of its life, bitter beyond belief, and might include crushed eggshells or even salt to reduce the bitterness. Still, the caffeine would help you face the day, so you drink it without complaint. Before heading outside, you might want to check your shoes for scorpions or snakes that could have sought shelter during the night. It wasn't uncommon for frontier folks to shake out their boots each morning, a habit born from painful experience. One wrong move and you could be facing a venomous bite miles from any medical help. Stepping outside your cabin, you're immediately aware of how exposed you are. The vast landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, sure, but it was also unforgiving. Extreme weather could appear with little warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or drought could all mean death for the unprepared. The sky might be clear now, but that could change in minutes. If you've settled in a frontier town, you might think civilization offers some protection. In some ways, that's true. In others, it just presents different dangers. Towns in the Wild West were hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage systems or understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread rapidly through communities. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats. An outbreak could wipe out half a town in weeks. Speaking of towns, let's say you decide to visit one today. As you approach, you notice there's a distinct lack of the organized layout you might expect. Many Western towns grew haphazardly with buildings constructed wherever convenient, often without proper planning or infrastructure. The streets aren't paved, but are instead dirt tracks that transform into mud pits when it rains and dust bowls when it's dry. The smell hits you again stronger. Now horse manure is everywhere, because horses are the main transportation. There are no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some towns, the accumulated waste could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas. Flies swarm around you, and you realize why disease spreads so easily here. As you walk down the main street, you pass the saloon, likely one of the busiest establishments in town. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, saloons weren't glamorous places with swinging doors and piano players. Most were crude one-room affairs with rough plank bars and basic furniture. The liquor served wasn't fine whiskey, aged in oak barrels, but raw alcohol, often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it extra kick. A single drink could blind you if you were unlucky. The saloon represents another deadly aspect of frontier life violence. These establishments were frequently sites of deadly confrontations, not because of formal duels or showdowns, but because of drunken arguments that escalated quickly in a heavily armed society. The romanticized gunfights of Western movies were rare. Most violence was impulsive, messy, and over-trivial matters. Speaking of being armed, you'll notice almost everyone carries a weapon of some kind, but not for the reasons you might think. While personal protection was certainly a factor, weapons were primarily tools for hunting, protection from wildlife, and sometimes for signaling. The constant threat from bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes made going unarmed foolish, especially when traveling between settlements. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to surrender their firearms when entering town limits. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Clanton gang refused to comply with Tombstone's weapons ordinance. Despite what you've seen in movies, quick-draw duels in the middle of the street were exceedingly rare. Most shootings were ambushes or happened during robberies. The skilled gunslinger facing off against an opponent at high noon is largely a Hollywood invention. Real frontier violence was typically sudden, chaotic, and lacked any sense of honor or fairness. As you continue your walk, you pass the local doctor's office medical care in the 1870s. Frontier would horrify you. Most doctors had little or no formal training. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia beyond whiskey or morphine, and sterilization was virtually unknown. Something as simple as an infected cut could lead to amputation or death. Common treatments included bloodletting, mercury compounds, arsenic, and other toxic substances that often did more harm than good women in childbirth, faced mortality rates as high as 1 in 4 in remote areas. Dentistry involved extraction without anesthesia using crude tools. Most people suffered from painful dental issues for years before finally losing their teeth. If you were injured or fell ill on the frontier, your survival often depended more on luck than medical intervention. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening due to infection. Broken bones might never heal properly, leaving frontier folk with chronic pain and disability. The famous phrase, "only the strong survive," had literal meaning in the Wild West. Your stomach growls again and you realize it's time for lunch. You head to the local restaurant, which is likely just an extension of someone's home, where meals are served for a fee. The food isn't any more varied than your breakfast. Meat is tough and often spoiled, despite heavy smoking or salting vegetables if available are overcooked to mush. Food safety standards don't exist, so dysentery and food poisoning are common occurrences, or while eating you overhear conversations about recent Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, or the danger of traveling alone. While Native American violence against settlers was far less common than portrayed in popular culture. In fact, settlers and the U.S. military were far more likely to be the aggressors. The frontier was still a place of conflict. The systematic displacement of indigenous peoples created tensions that sometimes erupted into violence on both sides. As for outlaws, they were a genuine threat. Particularly in remote areas, law enforcement was sparse with a single sheriff, sometimes responsible for thousands of square miles. In many places, justice was handled through vigilante action rather than formal legal proceedings. Lynch mobs were common, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply. If you were accused of horse theft or cattle rustling, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before sunset. Regardless of your actual guilt or innocence after lunch, you decide to visit the local general store to stock up on supplies. The prices shock you. Basic necessities cost far more on the frontier than back east due to the difficulty and expense of transportation. A simple can of peaches might cost the equivalent of $20 in today's money. Many settlers spent most of their income on essential supplies with little left over for comfort or luxury. The store offers another glimpse into frontier reality. The isolation mail delivery was infrequent and unreliable. Newspapers might be weeks or months out of date. Information traveled slowly, and you might go years without news from a family back east. Many settlers never saw their relatives again after moving west. The psychological toll of this isolation contributed to high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among frontier populations. As the afternoon wears on, you notice dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather on the frontier wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Without modern forecasting, storms arrived with little warning. Blizzards could strand travelers, leading to freezing deaths. Tornadoes destroyed entire communities with no emergency services to assist survivors. Flash floods washed away wagon trains. Droughts ruined crops and caused starvation. If you were lucky enough to have a proper home, it provided minimal protection. Most frontier dwellings were hastily constructed from whatever materials were available. Sod houses on the plains, log cabins in forested regions, or simple wooden structures in towns. None were particularly effective against extreme weather. Winter temperatures inside could drop below freezing. Summer heat was often unbearable, especially in attics or upper floors where many people slept. As the storm approaches, you decide to head back to your cabin before it hits. On the way, you pass a group of men heading to work at the local mine. Mining was one of the deadliest professions on the frontier. Underground cave-ins, toxic gas exposure, explosions from improperly handled blasting powder, and machinery accidents claimed countless lives. Miners also suffered from long-term health issues like black lung, from coal dust, or mercury poisoning from gold processing. Even if you avoided mining, few frontier occupations were safe. Farming involved dangerous equipment with no safety features. Ranching meant working with unpredictable animals weighing hundreds of pounds. Logging had one of the highest fatality rates of any profession. Whatever you did to make a living, your risk of serious injury or death was exponentially higher than in the modern world. You make it back to your cabin just as the rain begins to fall. The roof leaks in several places and you place buckets to catch the water. This is a good opportunity to refill your drinking water. As clean water was scarce and precious, many frontier settlers drank from the same sources used for washing and watering livestock, leading to waterborne illnesses that could quickly turn fatal. As you sit in your leaky cabin listening to the rain, you reflect on how different reality is from the romanticized version of the Wild West. There were no heroes or villains, just people struggling to survive in incredibly harsh conditions. The fact that anyone made it through is testament to human resilience and determination. Night falls early as you have no electricity. Candles and oil lamps provide minimal illumination, and you're careful with them. Fire was a constant danger in frontier homes. A single spark could mean losing everything with no fire department to call for help. Many towns burned to the ground at least once in their history. You prepare for bed exhausted from just one day in the Wild West. Your muscles ache, your stomach is unsettled from the unfamiliar food, and your mind is overwhelmed by the constant vigilance required to stay alive. As you drift off to sleep, you wonder if you'll make it through tomorrow or if you'll become just another statistic in the dangerous story of the American frontier. The wind howls outside your cabin, a haunting reminder of how small and vulnerable humans are against the vastness of the untamed wilderness. Tomorrow, if you're lucky enough to see it, will bring all these challenges again, along with new ones you haven't yet imagined. In the Wild West, survival was never guaranteed. It was earned day by day, hour by hour through hardship. Most modern people can scarcely comprehend. The morning light filters through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from a restless sleep. Your body aches from the hard mattress, but there's no time to linger. The Wild West waits for no one. As you rise, you remember yesterday's harsh introduction to frontier life and wonder what new challenges today will bring. Let's say you decide to leave town today to travel across the frontier. Whether you're heading to another settlement, joining a wagon train west, or simply exploring travel in the 1870s, was an entirely different experience than what you're used to. The good news is that by this time, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed connecting the east and west coasts of America. The bad news, unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Most frontier folks traveled by horse wagon or simply on foot. If you owned a horse, consider yourself fortunate. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them out of reach for many settlers. A good horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Then you needed saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care. Though veterinary care often meant shooting the animal if it broke a leg or developed certain illnesses. Riding itself was no pleasure cruise. Saddles in the 1870s weren't designed for comfort, but for function. Hours in the saddle left even experienced riders with blisters and aching muscles. And if your horse spooked at a snake or sudden noise, which happened frequently, you could easily be thrown, potentially suffering broken bones, or worse, miles from any help. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Forget the romantic image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system beyond the slight give in wooden wheels, meaning you felt every rock, rut, and hole in the trail. The constant jarring caused wagon sickness. Similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous and miserable. Roads, if they existed at all, were typically just dirt tracks carved by previous travelers. After rain, they became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle deep. During dry periods, the dust was so thick you could barely breathe or see. Wagons frequently broke down with wheels cracking or axles snapping miles from the nearest settlement. Let's say you've decided to journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train heading west on the famous Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the approximately 400,000 people who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that an average of 10 to 15 people died for every mile of the trail. Think about that. A grave. Every 350 feet or so for 2,000 meters. The trail was lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many without names, as families were forced to bury loved ones and continue their journey. Disease was the #1 killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera. A bacterial infection spread through contaminated water was particularly devastating. This horrible illness, caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluid so quickly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. There was no effective treatment available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever claimed countless lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple children during the journey. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often consisting of folk remedies that did little to help and sometimes made conditions worse. Crossing rivers presented another deadly challenge. Wagons weren't designed to float, but pioneers had to cross numerous rivers on their journey west. Some had ferries or fords, but many required the wagon to be floated across like a makeshift boat. Wagons frequently capsized in these crossings, drowning people and livestock and destroying precious supplies. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers claimed hundreds of lives during the migration period. Contrary to popular belief, attacks by Native Americans were relatively rare. Most tribes were actually helpful to migrants, offering supplies, guidance, and assistance with river crossings. The majority of violent deaths on the trail came from accidents being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearms accidents were shockingly common, as most travelers were inexperienced with weapons, but carried them for hunting and protection. The psychological toll of the journey was immense. Families buried children, parents, and spouses along the way, then had to continue traveling immediately. There was no time for extended grief on the trail. Each day's delay meant less chance of crossing the mountains before winter snows made passes impossible. The constant stress, grief, and physical hardship led many travelers to mental breakdown. Suicide was not uncommon among trail migrants. If you somehow survived the journey to California or Oregon, your challenges weren't over. Many arrived at their destination having spent all their money and resources on the journey itself. Families often arrived destitute, malnourished, and ill, only to find that the promised land had its own harsh realities. But let's say you've decided not to travel that far. Perhaps you're heading to a nearby town or settlement instead. Even short journeys in the Wild West presented significant dangers. Travelers might encounter outlaws who saw lone riders or small groups as easy targets. While the frequency of stagecoach robberies was exaggerated in later fiction, they did occur regularly enough to be a legitimate concern. The natural environment posed constant threats to travelers. Flash floods could wash out trails or trap unwary travelers. Summer heat in desert regions could kill through dehydration and heat stroke. Winter blizzards routinely trapped travelers, sometimes leading to freezing deaths, or desperate situations like the infamous Donna Party, where survivors resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. Navigation itself was challenging in an era before detailed maps. Travelers relied on vague directions, landmarks that could change or be misidentified, and the experience of guides who sometimes proved unreliable. Getting lost in the wilderness could be a death sentence, especially if your supplies ran low. As you travel today, you notice another aspect of frontier life that movies rarely depict accurately: the stunning diversity of people. The Wild West wasn't populated solely by white cowboys and settlers. It was a meeting ground of cultures from around the world. Chinese immigrants worked as railroad builders, miners, and merchants. Mexican families had been living in the Southwest long before it became U.S. territory. Black cowboys made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their cultures and traditions. And of course, dozens of distinct Native American nations had called these lands home for thousands of years before others arrived. This diversity, however, didn't mean equality or harmony. Racial violence was a common feature of frontier life. Chinese railroad workers faced brutal discrimination and were often forced to take the most dangerous jobs for lower pay than white workers. Mexican landowners frequently saw their property seized through legal manipulation or outright theft after the Mexican-American War. Black Americans who moved west hoping to escape Southern discrimination often found frontier racism just as entrenched, if different in form. Despite their crucial contributions to ranching, mining, and building frontier communities, they were frequently excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance. For Native Americans, the expansion of white settlement was nothing short of catastrophic. The indigenous population of North America, once numbering perhaps 15 million people, had been reduced to fewer than 300,000 by 1900. Disease warfare forced relocation and the deliberate destruction of their food sources. Particularly the buffalo decimated numerous tribes and nations. U.S. government policies systematically pushed Native Americans from their traditional lands onto reservations, often in areas with poor soil and few resources. Treaties were regularly broken when valuable resources were discovered on reservation lands. Native children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools, designed to erase their cultural identity operating under the philosophy of kill the Indian, save the man. The romanticized cowboys versus Indians narratives of later films grossly misrepresented the complex interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples. Many native nations initially tried to accommodate newcomers and adapt to changing circumstances. Violence typically erupted after repeated treaty violations, encroachment on tribal lands, or deliberate provocations. As you continue your journey, you ponder another group whose experience differed markedly from Hollywood depictions. Women on the frontier, far from the helpless damsels or school moms of Western movies. Frontier women performed incredibly demanding physical labor while navigating restrictive social expectations. On homesteads and farms, women not only handled traditional domestic duties like cooking, cleaning, childcare, and making clothing, but also worked in the fields, tended livestock, and defended the home when necessary. Their workday typically started before dawn and ended well after dark, with few, if any, days of rest. A frontier woman might need to plow fields in the morning, deliver a neighbor's baby at midday, fight off predators threatening the livestock in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and care for her own children throughout. Many women became widows young due to the dangerous nature of frontier life, and had to manage farms or businesses alone while raising children. Despite their essential contributions, women had few legal rights. In most territories and states, they couldn't vote, own property independently if married, or have custody of their children. In the event of divorce, domestic violence was considered a private matter with little legal recourse available to victims. For unmarried women, options were severely limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions, though. Female teachers were paid significantly less than their male counterparts, and were often expected to resign upon marriage. Some women found economic independence through running boarding houses, working as nurses, or establishing millinery or dressmaking businesses. Then there were the soiled doves prostitutes who worked in frontier brothel and saloons. While later mythology romanticized these women, the reality was typically grim. Many entered the profession out of economic desperation after being widowed or abandoned. Physical abuse, drug addiction, and venereal disease were common hazards of the work. Even those who managed to earn substantial money found themselves socially ostracized and unable to transition to more respectable positions. Some women did find greater freedom on the frontier than they might have back east. The shortage of women in Western territories gave them more marriage options and sometimes better treatment, as communities competed to attract and keep female residents. A few territories like Wyoming and Utah granted women voting rights decades before the 19th Amendment, recognizing their essential contributions to frontier development. As the day wears on and you continue traveling, you might wonder about law enforcement in this supposedly lawless land. The reality was complex and varied widely by location. Major cities and towns typically had some form of organized law enforcement, but vast rural areas had minimal, if any, official protection. County sheriffs were elected officials responsible for maintaining order across sometimes enormous territories. A single sheriff might be the only law enforcement for thousands of square miles, making regular patrols impossible. They relied heavily on deputizing ordinary citizens during emergencies, creating posies to pursue criminals or respond to violence. Town marshals handled law enforcement within town limits, sometimes with a few deputies in larger settlements. These positions were often dangerous and poorly paid, attracting a mix of dedicated public servants and those who enjoyed the power the badge provided. Some famous lawmen, like Wyatt Herb, moved between legitimate law enforcement and more questionable enterprises throughout their careers. Federal marshals had jurisdiction throughout territories and states, but were few in number. They typically focused on major crimes like counterfeiting, mail robbery, or offenses involving multiple jurisdictions. The legendary U.S. Marshals of Western movies single-handedly bringing law to lawless towns were largely fictional creations. In many remote areas, justice was handled through informal community action rather than official legal processes. Vigilante groups formed to address perceived threats when formal law enforcement was absent or ineffective. Sometimes these groups maintained basic order, but they could easily become vehicles for prejudice, personal vendettas, or mob violence. The iconic image of the quick-draw gunfight was largely a later invention. Most frontier violence was mundane, impulsive, and often alcohol-fueled. Bar fights that escalated to fatal levels domestic violence and disputes over land or livestock were far more common than dramatic shootouts on dusty streets. Criminal punishment was harsh by modern standards. Hanging was the standard penalty for murder, rape, and sometimes theft. Particularly of horses or cattle, prisons existed, but were primitive facilities with high mortality rates from disease violence and poor conditions. Many communities preferred immediate execution to the expense of long-term imprisonment. As evening approaches, you decide to seek shelter for the night. If you're lucky, you might find a town with a hotel or boarding house. Don't expect luxury. Frontier accommodations were basic at best. A typical hotel room would have a simple bed, possibly infested with bed bugs, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and perhaps a chair. Bathroom facilities would be an outhouse in the back shared by all guests. Privacy was minimal, with thin walls allowing you to hear your neighbors' every movement and conversation. In busier establishments, you might even share a bed with a stranger. A common practice to maximize capacity during busy periods. The sheets might not have been changed for previous guests, and lighting would be limited to candles or oil lamps. A night's lodging would cost between 25 cents and $1, depending on the establishment's quality and location. This represented a significant expense for many travelers, equivalent to several hours' wages for an average worker. Many chose to sleep in stables, barns, or simply under the stars. To save money, despite the additional risks these options presented. If you were traveling through more remote areas, you'd likely camp for the night. This meant building a fire, assuming you could find enough fuel, preparing a meal from your limited supplies, and sleeping on the ground with minimal protection from the elements. Or wildlife indigenous peoples experienced, travelers and military scouts had sophisticated techniques for safe camping. But the average settler often made dangerous mistakes. Proper fire management was literally a matter of life and death. A fire built too large could spark a prairie or forest fire that could consume thousands of acres in hours. One built too small might not provide enough warmth during cold nights, leading to hypothermia. Campfire cooking required skills most modern people lack, often resulting in meals that were simultaneously burnt and raw. As night falls fully and you prepare to sleep, the sounds of the frontier darkness surround you. Coyotes howl in the distance, unfamiliar birds call, the wind whispers through grass or trees. For people accustomed to modern light and noise pollution, the profound darkness and strange sounds of wilderness nights often triggered intense anxiety. Many travelers slept poorly on the frontier, not just because of physical discomfort, but from fear of the unknown dangers that might lurk in the darkness. Native attacks, though rare, often occurred at dawn, when sleepers were at their most vulnerable. Predators like wolves, bears, and mountain lions might investigate camps looking for food. Venomous snakes and scorpions sought warm places to rest sometimes, including a sleeper's bedroll. Even if no actual threats materialized, the psychological stress of constant vigilance took its toll. Frontier diaries frequently mention exhaustion not just from physical labor, but from the mental strain of perpetual alertness. Modern people accustomed to locks, alarms, and the security of dense population would find the vulnerability of frontier sleeping arrangements profoundly disturbing. As you drift towards sleep, you reflect on the day's journey. Travel in the Wild West bears almost no resemblance to its sanitized, romanticized portrayal in later entertainment. It was grueling, dangerous, and uncomfortable beyond what most modern people could endure. The skills required from navigation without maps to making emergency repairs to handling firearms safely took years to develop, and mistakes were often fatal. The darkness deepens, and the sounds of night creatures grow louder. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. If you survive the night, perhaps you'll reach your destination, or perhaps you'll become just another unmarked grave along the trail. One more statistic in the perilous story of westward expansion. The Wild West forgave no weakness and offered no second chances. Every day survived was a victory against overwhelming odds. The new day dawns on the frontier, and you've somehow survived the night. A victory in itself in the Wild West. As you rub the sleep from your eyes and stretch your aching muscles, you contemplate what direction your frontier experience might take. Today, perhaps you'll try your luck in one of the booming mining towns where fortunes are supposedly made overnight. You've heard stories of the California gold rush, the Nevada silver strikes, and the Colorado mining booms. Tales of ordinary men finding nuggets the size of chicken eggs and becoming wealthy overnight have drawn hundreds of thousands west. What these stories don't mention are the brutal realities awaiting those who chase mineral dreams. Let's say you decide to try your hand at mining. What would that actually entail? First, you'd need to stake a claim, which means finding unclaimed land with potential mineral deposits increasingly difficult by the 1870s, as the easiest and richest areas were claimed years earlier. If you were lucky enough to find a promising spot, you'd need to register your claim at the nearest government office and pay the required fees, which could be substantial. Then the real work would begin, and it was some of the most physically demanding labor imaginable for placer mining. Searching for loose gold in streams, you'd spend hours bent over in ice-cold mountain water, sifting through sediment with a pan or cell box. Your hands would crack and bleed from constant exposure to water and rough materials. Your back would ache from the hunched position. And after all that effort, you'd be lucky to find a few tiny flakes of gold worth pennies. If you ventured into hard rock mining, digging for veins of ore in the mountains, the dangers multiplied exponentially. Tunneling into unstable rock, without modern safety equipment or engineering knowledge, led to frequent cave-ins that crushed miners where they stood. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with toxic gases like carbon monoxide, odorless but deadly, suffocating miners who had no warning of the danger. Blasting with black powder or dynamite to break through rock was incredibly hazardous. Miners frequently lost fingers, hands, eyes, or lives when charges detonated prematurely, or thrown rock fragments became deadly projectiles. The thunderous noise and constant percussion of blasting left many with permanent hearing loss. Even if you avoided immediate catastrophes, the long-term health effects were devastating. Miners constantly inhaled fine rock dust, leading to silicosis, a painful lung disease that slowly suffocated its victims. Mercury used in gold processing caused neurological damage, tremors, and mental deterioration. Those working in copper or lead mines absorbed toxic metals that accumulated in their bodies, causing chronic illness and early death. The mining industry of the 1870s had virtually no safety regulations or oversight. Mine owners prioritized profit over worker welfare, and injuries were considered an expected part of the job. Medical care for injured miners was minimal and often ineffective. A serious injury typically meant the end of a miner's career and livelihood, with no disability support or workers' compensation available. For all these risks and hardships, what was the likely reward despite the mythology of the lucky prospector? The vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, most worked for large mining companies rather than independently earning two toast, $3 for a grueling 10 to 12-hour day. Studies suggest that storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes consistently made more money than the miners whose dreams sustained frontier mining towns. Speaking of mining towns, they were notoriously rough places. Imagine a community composed primarily of young single men engaged in dangerous work with few women, families, or civilizing institutions. Alcohol consumption was astronomical. The average mining camp resident consumed several times more alcohol than the typical American today. Violence was commonplace, with fights, stabbings, and shootings occurring regularly. Sanitation in mining camps was typically abysmal, with minimal planning or infrastructure. Human waste and garbage accumulated in streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly in these conditions. During warm months, the stench could be overwhelming, and swarms of flies spread disease from waste to food. If you managed to find valuable ore, you faced the challenge of converting it to cash. Banking in the Wild West was primitive and often predatory. Many mining towns had no banks at all, forcing miners to carry gold dust or ore, making them targets for theft. Some saloons and general stores offered to buy gold, but frequently at rates far below actual value, taking advantage of miners' limited options. Where banks did exist, they operated with minimal regulation, or oversight. Bank failures were common, often wiping out customers' life savings without warning or recourse. Many bankers were little more than confidence men who established storefronts, collected deposits, and disappeared overnight with all the funds. Without federally backed currency, paper money was issued by individual banks, and its value fluctuated wildly depending on the bank's reputation. Counterfeit bills circulated widely, and even experienced merchants could be fooled by well-made fakes. The safest form of money was gold or silver coin, but carrying it made one a target for robbery. Perhaps after considering the dangers and disappointments of mining, you decide to try your hand at ranching instead. The cattle industry was booming in the 1870s, with demand for beef in eastern cities, creating opportunities on the frontier. Surely this would be a healthier, more profitable venture. Ranching did indeed avoid some of the worst health hazards of mining, but it introduced its own unique dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required significant capital land. Livestock, equipment, and buildings all represented major investments. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt purchasing these necessities, betting their future on favorable weather and market conditions. Nature often had other plans. Droughts could wither grazing lands and dry up crucial water sources, forcing ranchers to either watch their cattle starve or sell at devastating losses. Harsh winters could kill entire herds, as happened in the infamous Great Deup of 1886 to 1887. When up to 90% of cattle on northern ranges froze or starved to death during unusually severe weather, disease could sweep through herds, wiping out a rancher's investment overnight. Texas fever, anthrax, and other infectious diseases had no effective treatments in the 1870s. Predators like wolves and cougars took a constant toll on livestock, particularly vulnerable calves. Poisonous plants, quicksand, and injuries further reduced herds. The iconic cattle drives, moving herds hundreds of miles to railroad shipping points, were not romantic adventures, but grueling, dangerous undertakings. Cowboys, not the glamorous figures of later films, but typically young, poorly paid laborers, worked 20-hour days during drives, catching brief naps in the saddle as they moved thousands of animals across difficult terrain. These drives faced constant threats. River crossings could turn deadly in minutes if animals panicked, creating deadly pileups that drowned cattle and cowboys alike. Stampedes, which could be triggered by something as simple as a lightning strike or a snapping twig, turned thousands of 1,500-pound animals into an unstoppable destructive force. Cowboys caught in stampedes were often trampled to death. The cowboy's life was far from the freedom portrayed in Western mythology. They typically earned about $30 per month for exhausting, dangerous work. Most were very young men, often teenagers from poor backgrounds with few other options. A significant percentage were Black, Mexican, or mixed-race individuals facing discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere. Their diet on the trail consisted mainly of beans, salt pork, and biscuits with minimal fresh food. Medical care was limited to whatever the trail cook might know about folk remedies. Injuries common in such dangerous work often went untreated until they became life-threatening. Many cowboys died young from injuries, exposure, or violence. Perhaps ranching doesn't appeal after all. What about farming, surely growing food? The most fundamental of human activities would offer a more stable and less dangerous way of life on the frontier. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened vast areas of the West to settlement, offering 160 acres free to anyone who would live on and improve the land for 5 years. This seemed like an incredible opportunity, a chance for people with little money to become landowners and build independent livelihoods. The reality proved far more challenging than the promise first. 160 acres might sound substantial, but in the arid regions that comprised much of the available land, it was often insufficient to support a family. Traditional Eastern farming methods failed in these environments where rainfall was a fraction of what pioneers were accustomed to. Many settlers had no knowledge of dry farming techniques needed for success in these regions. Starting a frontier farm required tremendous physical labor. The first task was building shelter, typically a sod house on the treeless plains, constructed by cutting and stacking dense prairie turf. These sodas were dark, damp dwellings that leaked when it rained, harbored insects and snakes, and crumbled without constant maintenance. Then came the backbreaking work of breaking the land, for planting prairie sod, held together by dense grass roots that had developed over centuries, was extraordinarily difficult to plow with the equipment available to most settlers. It could take a year or more just to prepare a few acres for planting. The work was so physically demanding that it permanently damaged many farmers' bodies. Once crops were planted, farmers faced threats from every direction. Drought could wither plants before harvest. Torrential rains could wash away seedlings or flood fields. Early frost could kill crops just before harvest. Grasshoppers descended in biblical swarms, consuming everything green in their path, and sometimes even eating the handles of tools. Left in fields disease affected frontier farmers, as it did everyone else, but with particularly devastating consequences. With no hired help and little community support, a family's illness during crucial planting or harvesting periods could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Women often continued working the fields while heavily pregnant, or just days after giving birth, risking their health because the work simply couldn't wait. Farm accidents were common and often fatal. Homemade tools broke and caused injuries. Animals panicked and trampled their handlers. Even successful harvests could turn deadly. Numerous farmers died when they fell into grain storage bins and suffocated in the loose grain, or when poorly constructed storage buildings collapsed under the weight of their contents. The isolation of frontier farms took a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors might be miles away, visited only occasionally. Women in particular suffered from this isolation, some going months without speaking to anyone outside their immediate family. Depression, anxiety, and what was then called prairie madness affected many settlers, sometimes leading to abandonment of homesteads or suicide. For those who persevered through these challenges and actually produced crops, economic obstacles remained. Transportation to markets was difficult and expensive. Without refrigeration, perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved. Large agricultural corporations and railroad companies used their influence to keep crop prices low and transportation costs high, squeezing independent farmers from both directions. By the 1870s, another option was emerging on the frontier, working for wages in the growing towns and industries. Perhaps this offered a safer, more stable path than the high-risk ventures of mining, ranching, or farming. White labor did avoid some of the worst physical dangers and financial risks of independent enterprises, but introduced its own hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses or safety equipment, leading to frequent fatal falls. Railroad work was particularly dangerous. Track layers worked with minimal equipment under brutal conditions, suffering high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Chinese workers who built much of the transcontinental railroad were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. Working hours were long, by modern standards, typically 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Pay was low, with most workers barely earning subsistence wages. Child labor was common, with children as young as 8 or 9 working alongside adults in many industries, often suffering higher injury rates due to their size and inexperience. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay entirely. Those who complained or attempted to organize for better conditions faced blacklisting, being marked as troublemakers who no other employer in the region would hire. Company town settlements, where a single employer owned all housing, and businesses were common in mining and lumber regions. Workers in these communities paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company housing, and sometimes were paid in script company currency rather than legal tender. This created a form of debt bondage where workers could never save enough to escape the system. Whether you mined, ranched, farmed, or worked for wages frontier, life shaped your experiences in ways modern people would find disorienting. Perhaps most striking was the relationship with time, not the carefully measured minutes and hours of our digital age, but a more fluid reality governed by daylight seasons and natural rhythms. Without electric lighting, most people woke at dawn and slept shortly after sunset, their active hours expanding and contracting with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in 8-hour shifts, but by tasks that needed completion: fields plowed, cattle moved, or extracted. During harvest or roundup, people might work from first light until well after dark for weeks without a break. During winter, many rural workers had periods of relative inactivity when fields lay dormant or cattle needed minimal tending. The concept of punctuality, so central to modern life, had limited relevance on the frontier, with few clocks and limited need for precise timing in most activities. People operated on approximate schedules. Stagecoaches and later trains introduced more precise times to the West. But outside these specific contexts, morning or after dinner were sufficiently specific time designations for most purposes. Entertainment and leisure looked nothing like their modern counterparts. After exhausting workdays, most frontier folks had little energy for complex activities. Conversation around the fire, storytelling, or simple card games were common evening pastimes. Music was popular when instruments and skilled players were available, with fiddles, harmonas, and guitars providing accompaniment for social dances. Reading material was precious and often shared among entire communities. A single book might be read aloud to gatherings of neighbors or passed from family to family until it fell apart from use. Newspapers, when available, were read repeatedly with every advertisement, and notice scrutinized for information about the wider world. Organized sports existed, but in simpler forms than today. Baseball was gaining popularity, played with minimal equipment on makeshift fields. Horse racing, wrestling, and shooting competitions provided both entertainment and opportunities to demonstrate valuable skills. Children played games that required little or no equipment. Tag, hide and seek, and variations of stickball that could be played with found objects. Holidays and community celebrations took on great importance as rare opportunities for socializing and recreation. 4th of July celebrations might draw people from miles around for picnic, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the year's most critical work. Religious holidays provided both spiritual meaning and welcome breaks from routine. As the day draws to a close, you find yourself reflecting on the relentless challenges of frontier life. Every aspect required harder work, involved greater risk, and offered fewer comforts than its modern equivalent. The people who survived and sometimes thrived in these conditions possessed qualities that modern society rarely demands. Extraordinary physical endurance, practical skills applicable to countless emergencies, and psychological resilience in the face of constant hardship and loss. The darkness gathers once more, and with it comes a silence profound enough to hear your own heartbeat. No car engines, no air conditioners, no electronic hums, just the whisper of wind, the chorus of insects, and the occasional call of night birds. This profound quiet, so alien to modern ears, was the soundtrack of frontier nights, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling in its emptiness. As you drift towards sleep, you wonder if you would have had what it took to survive here, not just for a day or a week, but for years and decades. The people who shaped the American West, for better and worse, were not the idealized heroes of later fiction, but complex individuals facing extraordinary challenges with the limited resources and knowledge of their time. Their story, stripped of romanticism, is one of human endurance against conditions that would break many of us today. The cool night air settles around you like a blanket, and the stars emerge in a display of brilliance impossible to see in our light-polluted modern world. This at least is one pure beauty the people of the frontier experience that few today can fully appreciate: the majestic sweep of the Milky Way across a truly dark sky, connecting them to the same cosmic panorama their ancestors had watched for countless generations. Morning arrives again in the Wild West, and with it comes hunger. A constant companion on the frontier food in the 1870s, West bore little resemblance to the varied, convenient diet you're accustomed to in the modern world. Let's explore what keeping yourself fed would actually entail in this harsh environment. The good news is that game was still relatively plentiful in many areas. Deer, elk, rabbit, and various birds could supplement your diet if you had the skills to hunt them. The bad news: hunting required ammunition, which was expensive and might be needed for protection. It also demanded time away from other essential work, making it a luxury many settlers couldn't afford during busy seasons. Most frontier families relied heavily on foods they could grow, preserve, or purchase in bulk. The staples of the frontier diet were beans, corn, and pork, dense in calories but monotonous and nutritionally incomplete. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available only in season, a few months at most, and winter diets often contained no fresh produce whatsoever. This lack of dietary variety led to widespread nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy caused by vitamin C deficiency was common during winter and early spring, when no fresh produce was available. The symptoms: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, joint pain, and eventually death were well known, but difficult to prevent with available resources. Other deficiency diseases affected growth in children and caused various chronic health problems in adults. Food preservation was a constant challenge and critical survival skill. Without refrigeration, meat needed to be consumed quickly or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. These methods deterred bacterial growth but drastically changed flavors and textures while reducing nutritional value. The heavy salt content of preserved foods contributed to high blood pressure and other health issues. Women spent enormous amounts of time preserving food when it was abundant for use during scarce periods. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar, or fermented fruits were dried or preserved with sugar if available. Root vegetables might be stored in root cellars, underground spaces that maintained cool temperatures. These preservation efforts were not optional activities, but essential survival work that could determine whether a family would eat during winter. Food storage presented its own problems. Properly prepared preserved foods could last months or even years, but improper techniques led to spoilage and potentially deadly food poisoning. Additionally, stored food attracted pests. Rats, mice, and insects consumed portions of most stored food supplies, and their droppings contaminated what remained. Most frontier families simply accepted a certain amount of insect parts and rodent droppings in their flour, beans, and other staples as unavoidable. Cooking itself was far more labor-intensive than modern people can easily comprehend. Meals were prepared over open hearths or wood-burning stoves that required constant attention and fuel. In wood-scarce prairie regions, women and children might spend hours gathering buffalo chips, dried manure, or twisted grass to burn as cooking fuel. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, often hundreds of pounds per day, for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Even with these efforts, meals lacked the variety and flavor profiles modern people expect. Spices were expensive luxuries used sparingly, if at all. Sugar and coffee were treasured items often hoarded for special occasions. Fresh milk was available only if a family kept a cow. And for only part of the year when the cow was producing, most frontier children grew up with simple, repetitive diets that would horrify modern nutritionists. Interestingly, despite these, era included bloodletting, which weakened already ill patients' imperatives that caused severe diarrhea, supposedly to expel bad humors and picuses of various substances, applied to wounds, some of which introduced infection rather than preventing it. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely used for pain, leading to addiction. In many cases, mercury compounds were prescribed for numerous conditions, despite their toxicity. Even when treatments had some validity, impure medications caused problems without pharmaceutical regulations or standardization. Commercially sold medicines varied wildly in potency and often contained dangerous contaminants. Many patent medicines marketed as cure-alls contained primarily alcohol, providing temporary relief through intoxication rather than addressing underlying conditions. Surgery in frontier conditions was particularly horrific. Without effective anesthesia beyond alcohol, whiskey, or opium, patients endured excruciating pain during procedures. Sterilization was unknown or inconsistently practiced, leading to rampant post-surgical infections. Amputation was the standard treatment for serious limb injuries performed with swords and knives that might be wiped clean, but never properly sterilized. Childbirth represented perhaps the starkest contrast between frontier and modern medical experiences. Women typically gave birth at home, attended by a midwife if one was available or female relatives if not. Without prenatal care, many complications weren't identified until labor was underway. Breech birth, hemorrhage, and other emergencies that modern medicine handles routinely often resulted in the death of mother-child, or both. Maternal mortality rates on the frontier were approximately 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than in developed countries today. Many women approached each pregnancy knowing it might be their last experience in life. Men's diaries and letters from the period frequently mention the heartbreaking reality of raising children alone after losing wives in childbirth. The combined impact of inadequate nutrition, constant physical strain, minimal preventive care, and primitive treatment options meant that frontier populations experienced health outcomes more similar to developing nations today than to modern America. Life expectancy at birth was under 40 years, with those surviving childhood likely to suffer chronic health problems by their 50s if they lived that long. Beyond these material hardships, frontier life imposed a form of isolation and disconnection that modern people accustomed to instant global communication would find almost unbearable. This isolation shaped frontier psychology and culture in profound ways. Communication with distant family or friends occurred at the speed of physical transportation. Letters took weeks or months to reach recipients if they arrived at all. News traveled slowly and unreliably, often distorted through retelling. Major events might not become known in remote areas until months after they occurred. This information vacuum contributed to a highly localized worldview, where distant events seemed abstract and irrelevant compared to immediate community concerns. The isolation was particularly difficult for those accustomed to more settled environments. Women who had grown up with close female friendships and family networks often found themselves alone for days or weeks while husbands traveled for supplies or work. Their diaries frequently mention crippling loneliness and the psychological strain of having no adult conversation for extended periods. This isolation sometimes led to what contemporary accounts called prairie madness, severe depression, anxiety, and occasionally psychosis, triggered by the combination of isolation, constant work, and environmental hardships. Some affected individuals became violent toward family members or committed suicide. Others simply abandoned their homesteads and returned east, unable to endure the psychological pressure of frontier life. Even in established communities, social connections were limited by practical constraints. Visiting neighbors might require traveling several miles each way, a significant undertaking when time was precious and transportation limited to walking or horseback. Formal social gatherings were infrequent, typically centered around church services, seasonal celebrations, or community work events like barn raisings or harvest festivals. Churches played a crucial role in frontier communities beyond their spiritual function. They served as social hubs, educational centers, and mutual aid societies. Even those with limited religious conviction often participated in church activities for the community connection. They provided religious leaders, ministers, priests, or lay preachers, frequently took on roles far beyond religious guidance, serving as teachers, dispute mediators, and community organizers. The establishment of community institutions marked important milestones in frontier development. Building a school church or Meeting Hall represented a commitment to permanent settlement rather than temporary exploitation. These institutions helped transform mining camps or trading posts into towns with collective identities and shared futures. The creation of local governments, rudimentary as they often were, similarly marked transitions from frontier chaos to established community. Frontier communities also developed distinctive forms of mutual aid and collective action necessary for survival in harsh conditions. Barn raisings and house raisings allowed families to complete large construction projects impossible for individual households. Harvest teams moved from farm to farm ensuring crops were gathered before weather could destroy them. Spontaneous search parties formed when children went missing. These cooperative traditions reflected the practical reality that no individual or family could survive the frontier entirely through self-reliance. This community interdependence existed alongside the individualism that later became mythologized in frontier narratives. Both elements were necessary responses to frontier conditions. Self-reliance for daily survival, community cooperation for challenges beyond individual capacity. The tension between these values shaped frontier culture and continues to influence American attitudes toward government, community, and individual responsibility. As another day in the Wild West draws to a close, you find yourself contemplating the mental and emotional resilience required to endure such conditions year after year. The people who populated the American frontier weren't superhuman. They suffered, struggled, and sometimes broke under the relentless pressure of their environment. But many adapted and persevered, developing skills and perspectives that allowed them to find meaning and even joy amid hardship. The darkness settles around you once more, bringing with it the profound silence of the pre-industrial night. The day's experiences have given you a glimpse into a world both familiar and utterly alien. A world where survival required constant vigilance, where comfort was rare and luxury almost non-existent, where death was an everyday companion rather than a distant stranger. As sleep approaches, you wonder about the people who chose this life or had it thrust upon them by circumstance. What drove them west? What sustained them through blizzards, droughts, illness, and loss? What would they think of the world? Their struggles helped create a world of abundance and security beyond anything they could have imagined. Built on foundations they laid through exhausting labor and countless sacrifices, the questions follow you into dreams filled with endless prairies, towering mountains, and the faces of those who tamed the Wild West, not through romantic gunfights, but through the quiet heroism of daily persistence against overwhelming odds. Their story, stripped of Hollywood glamour and frontier mythology, stands as a testament to human adaptability and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Dawn breaks on what will be your final day in the Wild West. As the golden light spills across the landscape, you take a moment to appreciate the raw beauty that drew so many westward. Despite the dangers and hardships, the frontier was a place of stunning natural grandeur, vast prairies rippling like oceans, mountains scraping the sky, canyons plunging into the earth's depths. This beauty at least wasn't a Hollywood invention, but even this relationship with the natural world differed profoundly from modern environmental perspectives. The frontier mentality viewed nature primarily as a resource to be conquered and exploited rather than preserved or protected. Timber was cut without consideration for regeneration. Game was hunted to the edge of extinction in many regions. Streams were diverted, polluted, or destroyed for mining operations with no thought for downstream consequences. The near extinction of the American bison buffalo stands as perhaps the starkest example of this exploitative approach. In the 1700s, an estimated 3,060,000,000 bison roamed North America. By 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. This devastation wasn't simply the result of hunting for food or hides, though that played a part. It was also deliberate policy encouraged by the U.S. government as a way to deprive Plains Indian tribes of their primary resource, forcing them onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan, a key military leader in the Plains Indian Wars, reportedly stated, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not he actually spoke these exact words, they accurately reflect government policy of the era. The destruction of the buffalo herds was environmental warfare designed to break indigenous resistance by eliminating their way of life. For Native American nations across the West, the expansion of white settlement represented an apocalypse, not just physical, characterized by individual prospectors, independent farmers, and small-scale enterprises, was giving way to more organized corporate development of Western resources. The arrival of railroads catalyzed this transition. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, dramatically reduced travel time between East and West. From months to days, subsequent branch lines penetrated previously isolated regions, connecting them to national markets and supply chains. This transportation revolution allowed large-scale extraction of Western resources for Eastern factories and enabled mass-reduced Eastern goods to flood Western markets. These economic connections accelerated the integration of Western regions into national systems, but often disadvantaged small producers. Independent miners couldn't compete with large mining corporations that brought industrial methods, and capital investment. Family farms struggled against agricultural enterprises operating on vast acreage. Small ranchers found themselves squeezed by cattle companies with investor backing and political connections. Corporate interests increasingly dominated political as well as economic structures. Railroad companies, mining conglomerates, timber interests, and large landholders exercised enormous influence over territorial and early state governments. Water rights, mineral claims, grazing access, and timber concessions were allocated through processes that typically favored those with financial and political power, rather than small operators or community interests. This transition from frontier to integrated region wasn't simply economic, but cultural. The rough-edged mining camp or cattle town gradually acquired institutions that signaled permanence and connection to wider society: banks, schools, churches, newspapers, theaters, and fraternal organizations. Streets were surveyed and sometimes paved. Wooden structures were replaced with brick and stone buildings. Local governments enacted ordinances regulating behavior that had previously gone ungoverned. For many who had been attracted to the frontier precisely because of its freedom from Eastern constraints, these changes represented unwelcome domestication of the wild spaces they had sought. Some continually moved westward ahead of advancing civilization seeking new frontiers. Others struggled to adapt to increasing regulation, competition, and social expectations. The mythological end of the frontier declared in the 1890 census represented real psychological and cultural challenges for those whose identities were tied to frontier conditions. Part of this transformation involved the taming, or at least management, of frontier violence. The iconic gunfighters and outlaws who would later dominate Western mythology operated in a specific historical window when formal law enforcement was establishing itself against pre-existing systems of personal and community violence. By the 1880s and 1890s, professional police forces and court systems had replaced vigilante justice in most established communities, though remote areas still saw occasional eruptions of frontier-style conflict resolution. The legendary figures who captured public imagination: Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid. Jesse James operated in this transitional period, often moving back and forth between legal and illegal activities as circumstances changed. Their later mythologization obscured the complex, often morally ambiguous reality of their lives. Hickok, far from the perfect marksman of legend, shot bystanders in at least 2 gunfights. Earp worked variously as a lawman, gambler, brothel keeper, and vigilante across his career. The Robin Hood image attached to Jesse James ignored his Confederate guerrilla background and the innocent victims of his robberies. As evening approaches on your final day in the Wild West, you find yourself contemplating the gap between frontier reality and the mythology that would later emerge from it. Why did Americans and eventually the world become so fascinated with a romanticized version of this brutal period? What needs did these myths serve, and what truths did they obscure? Part of the answer lies in timing. The most intense period of frontier mythology making occurred precisely as the actual frontier was disappearing. The Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill Cody began in the 1880s, featuring staged reenactments of Indian battles and stagecoach robberies for Eastern audiences. Even as railroads, telegraph lines, and formal governance were integrating Western regions into mainstream American society, these performances weren't meant as accurate historical recreations, but as entertainment that resonated with Eastern ideas about the West. The dime novels that popularized exaggerated tales of Western heroes originated not on the frontier but in Eastern publishing houses, written by authors who rarely had first-hand experience of the regions they described. These formulaic stories emphasized action-clear moral distinctions between heroes and villains and a vision of the West as a testing ground for American virtues of self-reliance, courage, and individualism. Later, Hollywood Westerns further refined and amplified these mythological elements, creating iconic images of lone cowboys, heroic sheriffs, dastardly outlaws, and savage Indians that bore little resemblance to historical reality. These films served psychological and cultural functions beyond entertainment. They offered reassuring narratives about American identity during periods of rapid social change and international challenges. The mythology suggested that American character had been forged in frontier conditions, producing exceptional qualities that distinguished the nation from older societies. It implied that American expansion across the continent had been not just inevitable but morally justified. A triumph of civilization over wilderness and progress over primitive cultures. It presented simplified moral frameworks where good invariably triumphed over evil through righteous violence, justifying America's growing military and economic power on the world stage. What these myths obscured was the complex, morally ambiguous reality of Western development. The genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the environmental devastation, the corporate manipulation of political systems, and the deeply divided community, struggling with fundamental questions about identity, governance, and resources. The Real West offered no simple moral lessons, but rather a case study in how human societies adapt to challenging conditions, sometimes showing remarkable cooperation and creativity, sometimes descending into exploitation and brutality. As darkness falls once more, you reflect on your brief journey through the unromanticized Wild West. You've experienced firsthand why the average person today, accustomed to abundant food, medical care, physical safety, and countless comforts unknown to frontier dwellers, would likely not survive even a single day in the actual conditions of the 1870s frontier. The skills, knowledge, physical conditioning, and psychological resilience required for frontier survival represent a way of life so distant from modern experience as to be almost unimaginable. Yet something about this world continues to fascinate us. Perhaps it's the raw honesty of a life stripped to essentials, where tasks have immediate consequences and achievements represent tangible victories against natural constraints. Perhaps it's the community interdependence that emerged from shared challenges, creating connections that transcended differences in background or belief. Perhaps it's simply the reminder that human beings can endure and even find meaning in conditions far harsher than most of us will ever face. The legacy of the American frontier extends beyond mythology into the actual structures and systems that shape modern American life. Property laws, water rights frameworks, federal-state relationships, approaches to natural resources, and countless other aspects of American governance emerged from frontier-era compromises and conflicts. The diversity of Western communities, despite efforts at forced assimilation, contributed to the multicultural reality of modern America. Even the continuing tensions between individual rights and collective welfare, local control and national standards, exploitation and conservation, have roots in frontier-era debates. For indigenous peoples, the frontier era represents not a glorious chapter in national expansion, but the devastation of ancient lifeways and the beginning of a long struggle for cultural survival and sovereignty that continues today. Their perspective reminds us that the simple triumphalist narrative of Western settlement ignores the complex civilizations that already existed and the incalculable knowledge lost through their disruption. The most accurate understanding of the frontier requires holding multiple perspectives, simultaneously acknowledging both the courage of those who built new communities in challenging conditions and the devastation experienced by those displaced by this expansion. As you drift towards sleep on your final night in the Wild West, the sounds of this earlier America surround you. The whisper of wind through prairie grass, the distant howl of coyotes, perhaps the faint piano notes from a saloon down the street. These sensory experiences at least connected all who lived through this era. Regardless of background or circumstance, the vast skies, extreme weather, imposing landscapes, and profound silences shaped everyone who encountered them, creating a shared relationship with the environment even amid cultural conflicts. Tomorrow you'll return to your own time, carrying with you a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in American history. You'll never again see a Western film or read a frontier novel without recognizing the sanitized, simplified version of a complex reality. You'll appreciate the extraordinary comfort and security of modern life achieved through technological advances unimaginable to frontier dwellers. You might find yourself more aware of the skills and knowledge lost in the transition to our specialized technology-dependent society, the practical self-sufficiency that allowed frontier people to build, repair, grow, preserve, and create what they needed with minimal outside support. Most importantly, you'll understand that the real story of the American West isn't found in gunfights and gold strikes, but in the daily struggles of ordinary people, men, women, and children of diverse backgrounds who faced extraordinary challenges with the limited resources available to them. Their story, without Hollywood embellishment, contains enough genuine courage, tragedy, innovation, conflict, cooperation, cruelty, and kindness to fill countless histories. Their legacy lives in the communities they established, the environmental changes they initiated, the cultural patterns they created, and the myths that grew from their experiences. The real Wild West disappeared long ago, transformed by technology, population, growth, economic integration, and environmental change into the modern American West of cities, suburbs, highways, and managed landscapes. Yet echoes of frontier experience persist in regional identities, local traditions, land use patterns, and governance structures. The memory of this formative period continues to influence how Americans understand themselves and their nation's development. Even as scholars and communities work to replace simplistic mythology with more accurate, inclusive understandings of this complex history. As you finally surrender to sleep, the boundary between past and present seems to blur. The challenges faced by frontier communities, adapting to environmental constraints, managing scarce resources, building functional communities among diverse populations, balancing individual freedom with collective needs remain relevant in new forms today. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the frontier experience is not a set of answers, but a collection of questions about human adaptation, community formation, and the relationship between people and the natural world. Questions each generation must answer anew as circumstances change. The stars shine brilliantly above. The same stars that guided travelers across the prairie helped farmers time their planting and gave comfort to homesick immigrants far from familiar landscapes. In this moment of connection across time, you feel a fleeting kinship with those who looked upon these same constellations a century and a half ago, wondering what tomorrow would bring in a world where survival was never guaranteed. But life, in all its harshness and beauty, was experienced with an intensity seldom matched in our more comfortable era. Sleep comes at last, and with it, dreams of a West both harsh and magnificent. A place where human vulnerability and resilience were displayed in equal measure, where diverse peoples collided and sometimes cooperated in ways that would shape a nation, and where the daily struggle for existence contained moments of transcendent connection with landscapes of breathtaking grandeur. The real Wild West, stripped of romantic illusion, offers a window into human experience at its most elemental, challenging, frightening, and occasionally sublime,